Hello again, my retro music loving friends. This is Ethan again, aka the Ghost Mall. Really glad to have you with me on another day in my home recording studio here. And what I thought I'd do today is bring you a little glimpse inside of a session which is not only further along, considerably further along than the one that I started with you in a previous video, but is more in line with the music that I usually produce for the Ghost Mall. So this song is a tune I've been working on for quite some time. It's called Say You Will, and what it is a very early to maybe mid 80s pop song. And this is a tune that I actually wrote the bulk of quite a while ago, like, I don't know, definitely more than a year ago. And I'm in the process of trying to finish up production on it for the Ghost Mall's upcoming EP, which is going to be all in this sort of style, sort of early to mid 1980s pop music, a mixture of sort of synth pop, like you might think of some of the British bands that were making really popular music in that era, like Human League and Howard Jones and Naked Eyes, some of my biggest inspirations, but also blending that with some of the American acts that I grew up listening to, like Madonna, Michael Jackson, of course, Hall & Oates. And that's kind of the sound that is the sound I'm principally going for with my music in the Ghost Mall, and this track is definitely up that alley. So what I wanted to do is show you what I already have and kind of give you some further insights into how I got here, not only in terms of songwriting and how I came up with the structure and the chord progression and the melody and how those fit together, but also the instrumentation I used, and let you look at some of the very 80s synthesizers that appear in this song, give you a little history if you nerd out around that stuff and whatnot. But before I go on any further, let me just play back this track and you can listen to I guess I'll play it back top to bottom so you can listen to what it is, and then we're going to break it apart. Here goes. All right, and there you have it. That is the whole session from beginning to end. And as we went through there, I tried to give you a little glimpse at each of the instruments that was playing. I'll break those down in more detail, of course. A couple things to know about how I got to this point in the session before we go on is this song was originally written in the key of D major. Let me show you what that sounded like here. So this is the main keyboard part. And so in the process of sort of working through the vocal melody and trying to nail it down, I decided that what was going to definitely work best for a vocalist was going to be to change the key, alter the key of the song slightly. That's really common, actually, when you're writing a tune, whether you're beginning the tune as an instrumental and you've written a melody but it's an instrumental melody, or maybe you're writing it with your voice in mind, or rather you're writing it from your voice's perspective, but later you have someone else in mind to sing it. Altering the key is probably more common than not. So what I ended up doing was to transpose the song down from D major 3 half steps into B major, and that's what you hear now. That's how this is sitting now. And a couple of artifacts from that. Most of these tracks are MIDI tracks. They're synthesizers or drum machine. But I have 2 guitars in there, and you might have noticed they sound a little weird, and that's because what happened is the original scratch guitars that I recorded on the first day I was composing this, just to get them down, had to be transposed along with the rest of the arrangement. And if you are a musician or a recording engineer or producer, you might already know this, but transposing audio often sounds a lot stranger and causes a lot more problems than transposing MIDI parts does. So these, I left them in so you could hear, but we got a sort of funky guitar part that comes in later in the tune. And then we have a lead guitar part over here, which I think you might not have heard the beginning of, but they're going to sound weird because using the transposition function on audio in my DAW creates not just pitch irregularities, but also timing irregularities. So this one definitely sounds strange, this lead that I played. And they were scratch parts anyway, so they were imperfect to begin with. So one thing that is going to be a step that I need to take toward finishing the production on this tune is going to be to re-record those guitar parts, which I was going to do anyway, regardless of any changes in the key, and do that in the proper key. So I'm going to mute those for now since they are not the final versions. Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about the inspiration of this tune and what I was going for with the sound before breaking down the individual parts and letting you hear more of the instrumentation. I got a lot of cool sounds in here, at least to my ear. So as I was mentioning when I started the video, the primary sort of inspiration for the Ghost Smalls music is definitely early to mid 80s pop music, both synth pop and even music that wasn't considered synth pop exactly, but just whatever was in the charts that I heard over and over again as a kid growing up. And for this song in particular, I had 2 major inspirations. On the one hand was Hall & Oates. I love those guys so much. I actually got to see them live a couple years ago, and it was incredible. And particularly songs like Private Eyes, which is my favorite of theirs probably, and Kiss on my list. And that informed this instrument here, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But the main keyboard comp throughout this song is an instrument which was used a lot by Hall & Oates and which was integral to those songs I just mentioned. And then on the other hand, I was thinking about Lucky Star by Madonna. So I wrote this tune with, having a female vocal in mind, partly because of that. And some of the other instrumental choices, like that funky guitar that I played for you just a minute ago, and in particular, this, oh, there it was, this little arp that you hear right at the beginning, this little synthesizer arpeggio that you hear right at the beginning, those were little choices made because of the inspiration of the song Lucky Star. So this was my attempt to sort of marry those inspirations. And so then the question becomes, okay, you have an inspiration in mind for something retro, and what were the key ingredients to those mixtures, to those recipes, and can you grab some of those ingredients and not, bake the same cake, so to speak, make your own thing out of it, but people are gonna immediately recognize that feeling that those old songs gave them, or still give them if you're a nostalgia addict like me. To that end, and this is true of almost all the stuff I produce with the Go Small, I try to limit myself to only instruments, or I guess they're digital recreations, that were available to the musicians making music in that style at that time. And I totally did that with this song. And in my previous video, I talked about limitations and how they really, I think, stoke creativity rather than stifle it. So I tried to imagine myself in a studio circa around 1984, maybe, and 1983, 1984, limit my choices to instrumentation that would have only been available then, and also not, imagine that I had a limitless budget and I had 12 or 15 different items. So here are the units that I used. The Oberheim DMX drum machine. This is a little bit of an anomaly. I'll get back to that. The Yamaha CP80 or CP70, the CP series electric grand piano, an electric guitar. The Yamaha DX1 synthesizer, I got two instances of that, here and here. The Rhodes Chroma synthesizer, which is really rare and super cool. This is a muted track that is sort of vestigial. The Roland JX3P analog synthesizer, two instances of that. And then the Emulator II sampler, two instances of that. So imagine my little studio setup in 1983-84 with these units, and I'm going to walk through what they are and why I chose them. But first, let me just play you back this drum beat. Okay, so this is the Oberheim DMX drum machine as it is available in the Addictive Drums 2 Real Machines refill, which is for an 80s drum addict. This is the thing. Listen to this. I'm going to solo this up for you. I hope that makes you want to dance, because it sure makes me want to dance. And so the Oberheim DMX drum machine came out in 1980, I believe, for the first time. And it is one of my top three, I would say, 80s drum machines, along with the Roland TR-707 and the Emu Drumulator. I love its sound. As you can tell, it's really snappy, it's really punchy, the toms are really punchy. And the music that I usually associate with the DMX, I think I talked about this in a previous video a little bit, but was really 80s hip-hop music. So Run DMC, for example, used the DMX in their music. And so I think about breakdancing and, that kind of stuff. And, soloed by itself, I think that these drum tracks definitely give you that feeling. If you didn't know what the melody or the harmonic content of the song was, you might think, oh yeah, I could break dance to that. Let's take it to the bridge. no pun intended, and listen to that sequence. If it makes you recall that style of music, then that's no surprise, because it was used a lot in that music. But it was also a machine, the DMX was, that was used by a lot of synth pop acts like New Order, for example. I think this was the machine in Blue Monday, if I'm not incorrect. Real punchy, snappy snare, some punchy toms, and that clap. It's just a classic drum machine for the age. So that was the first choice for the rhythms. And then, like I said, really where everything else started for me was the Yamaha CP electric grand piano. Now, I'm just going to play a little bit more so you can kind of get the feel for it, and then I'll tell you why I chose this. Lots of nice dynamics there. So this was an interesting piece of kit that emerged back in the late 70s and was popular into the early 80s. It was not a synthesizer, and nor was it really an electric piano like a Wurlitzer or a Rhodes might have been. What it was a sort of shrunken down grand piano with actual strings, but it was rigged up so that it could be electrically amplified. And so it had a pretty unique sound. And this is the one that was used, like I said. You hear it on Private Eyes by Hall & Oates. You hear it on Kiss on My List by Hall & Oates. You also heard it in songs like, what's another good example? Oh, My Life by Billy Joel. It's a great example of this. It had a real percussive kind of a sound that was definitely unlike anything else. And I thought it was perfect for this. So this is another instrument that was manufactured. I mentioned the DMX came from Addictive Drums by XLN Audio. This electric grand comes from Addictive Keys by XLN Audio. They have a whole electric grand unit for. There's what it looked like. It was portable, in theory, probably pretty heavy, but they have a whole a unit that recreates that, and here's what we got in detail. Another very 80s aspect of this sound is this tab here. It says Dim D. That's the Roland Dimension D chorus rack-mounted effects processor. This is a very chorusy, kind of washy, ethereal kind of a sound. If I mute out that channel, it's going to sound pretty different. There's that attack to it, but it doesn't have that thickness to it. And also you notice there was less noise. So you're going to hear some hiss there, and that came from the particular Dimension D unit that XLN Audio used for the samples for this library. But it's a great instrument. Let me finish walking through the instruments and the arrangement and some of the choices and how 80s they are, and then I might talk about the songwriting itself. But one thing about the songwriting is I mentioned in my previous video that I like to start with the melody. And so if you've got a melody and a rhythm and a bass line to indicate the chords, as I said in another video, you've really got a song. Let's play the first chorus with just those three parts. That would be enough to have a song. It's got a rhythm, it's got a melody you can sing, and at least you kind of know what the chords might be. But the next element of a song that is crucial, I think, just to fill it out, is to have some instrument playing chords. And so let's bring in the CP80 and hear that all together. Alright, so that sounds like a song, right? Everything else to me in this arrangement is just what I call the ear candy. That's not to say it's filler at all. What it is stuff that sort of optionally enhances the feeling, the emotion. I mean, it's all about the emotion, right? The atmosphere of the song, but isn't really necessary to call it a song. But from the standpoint of how I build up a song, you know, I definitely start with these elements that are soloed here. And so I've explained to you why I chose this for the chords, the electric grand, and I explained to you why I chose the DMX. So the DMX dates to about 1980. The CP line of pianos even earlier, late 70s. I'll come back to the bass. By the way, if you're hearing any kind of clicks or pops, little tiny noisy anomalies in the playback, it's probably because of this bass, which one of the things on my to-do list for finishing production of the song is to replace this bass, because lately Sonar has not been playing well with 32-bit plugins, and this is a old kind of vestigial 32-bit plugin that I like the sound of, but it's causing some little clicks and pops here and there. Let me talk next. I'm just going to make sure I still have you here on the video. Still recording. Okay, cool. Speaking of technical difficulties, we don't want that. So let me tell you about the sound for the melody here. This is from the Emulator II. And let me just play you a little snippet of that by itself. So the Emulator II, among 1980s pieces of gear that I wish I could own in physical form, is probably the preeminent one. I really wish I could get my hands on one of these. If you ever saw, of course you've seen it, especially if you're watching this video about 80s music, pop music production, you've seen it. When you watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the scene where Ferris is calling his friends at high school because he's at home playing sick, and he's playing on a keyboard with a floppy disk drive that's making coughing and sneezing noises. That was an Emulator II. I think that they first came out in 1984-ish, and it was not a synthesizer, it was a sampler. And so what it would do is load in little recordings, and these were low quality, you know, 8-bit recordings of sounds, and those would be mapped across the keyboard. So in this case, it's a vocal sound. Did it sound natural? No. Did it have its own thing going? Absolutely. The sort of like gritty sound of real instruments, but definitely with an artificial slant to them. It was well known for the string sounds, maybe the piano sounds, and these vocal sounds, and of course the orchestral hits, which is the other thing I used the Emulator II for in this arrangement. Let's just solo that up for a second. It's going to surprise you. So there were three main samplers of the day, known for this kind of, you know, use in these kinds of applications. They were the Fairlight CMI, which is the grandfather of them all. The Synclavier was another one, and the Emulator II. And they were all really expensive. I mean, you had to be Peter Gabriel, essentially, to own your own Fairlight CMI, for example. The Emulator II was the first one that sort of brought the price down, even though we're still talking 5 figures. At least when they were first released. But it allowed you to get a sort of, at least for the time, realistic sound of instruments that otherwise you would need $1 million recording studio and an orchestra to have on your records. So in this tune, I'm using it for sort of some of the most classic sounds they're known for, the hits. A very 80s thing. I want to shout out really quickly to definitely my favorite 80s retro themed music producer working today, one of the people who inspires me constantly. If you're a fan of this kind of music and you haven't heard Sunglasses Kid yet, go buy everything he's made. He's a genius, and you're going to hear this kind of sound, these orc hits all over his records, because that's the 80s right there. And then this voice also, the melody voice is definitely an emulator, a distinctive emulator sound, but of course I intended to replace this with a real vocal later, so it was just to have a placeholder, but something that was kind of, you know, tasty and authentic to the time. Alright, so at this point, you know, we built up an arrangement that has rhythm, bass, chords with some cool extensions, and a melody. Then from there, it was a process of adding more flavor through some additional parts. So one of the first things I came up with, which was also sort of inspired by Lucky Star by Madonna, was this little arpeggio here, coming from the DX1. Oh, I should definitely mention, if I haven't already, because I just take for granted that you all know about this incredibly awesome product, but most all of these sounds, except for a couple, you know, the drum kit and drum machine and the CP80, like I said already, come from XLN Audio and their addictive drums and addictive keys, which is fantastic. Most everything else in here, in fact, let's see, yeah, everything else in here comes from my absolute favorite. They're my favorite plug-in manufacturer, period, but they're, I think, uncontested in my mind as far as making stuff that will take you back to the 80s. And all of this comes from UVI, that's the manufacturer, and in particular from the UVI Vintage Vault, which is a collection, a massive collection of 80s synthesizer sounds, sampler sounds, and drum machine sounds. And I use it on every record in some capacity. Some records, like this one, are 90 to 100% from the Vintage Vault because they're just amazing recreations of the instrumentation from the day and age that I'm trying to capture. So this Emulation II, those emulators that I mentioned, come from the Vintage Vault. And the next thing I wanted to show you comes from the Vintage Vault also. So this is the FMX one, which is a recreation of the DX1 by Yamaha. That was a dual layer 6 operator FM synthesizer. You know, probably maybe the most well-known synthesizer sound from the 1980s was the electric piano sound that came from the DX line of synthesizers, and it was really great for bells and the like. And so here we have this little, you know, belly arpeggio. That probably would be right at home in a early 80s Madonna production. And just adding a little layer that wasn't there from the first verse into the second verse. So let me just play you going from the first verse into the second verse. A songwriting note here: you always want to be upping the ante as you proceed through the song, and in the sense of adding new things that will continue to capture the listener's attention. You don't want the verse to roll back around and have it be identical to the first time that the listener heard it. You want to add something. Even if adding something means taking something away. Maybe you have the kit drop out and or maybe you have the bass drop out and now it's just the vocal and the drums. But whatever it is, you need to vary that somehow so that we maintain that crucial balance I've been talking about often between repetition and novelty, you know, something new as well as something familiar, and getting that perfect balance is really the key to songwriting. So here I'm introducing a new element in the second half of the first verse. And it just gives not only a lift in terms of the tone, because that's a high part, it also adds a rhythmic element to the groove. And as you can see here, as you go down the timeline, I've got new things entering here, and just trying to add stuff as we go through to keep, as I said, piquing the listener's interest. So that was one sound that comes from the Yamaha DX1, and the other sound that's coming from the DX1 here is a super high pad sound in the choruses. It almost sounds like a whistle, right? And in the context of the music, it might not be audible particularly, but if I take it away, I think you miss it. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll play back with it, and then I'll drop it out and see if you notice something missing. Put it back in. It sort of adds a richness up at the top. And that's a trick that actually, if I'm remembering correctly, I learned from, it was like an interview, I think a print interview with the Pet Shop Boys, if I'm remembering correctly. But the idea that you have a really high note, maybe it's a violin or a synth pad, just sort of sustaining through the chorus, can really create a kind of lift and an added atmosphere. And so that's what I've done here in all the choruses with that part. What else do I have on the ear candy front? So talked about what came from the EMU emulator, the melody and the orc hits. Talked about the DMX drum kit. Talked about the CP electric piano playing the chords. I'll come back to the guitars maybe, but like I said, they're not in their final form. The other thing I wanted to add were some warm analog kind of synth parts. And so the first thing was to do a little funky dyads, some little funky notes over the chorus. And when I think funky analog, the instrument that I think of is the Roland JX3P synthesizer. So both the DX1 I just talked about and the JX3P I think debuted in like 1983. So right in the window I'm thinking of. At the time, Roland, I think that when people think of Roland analog synthesizers from the early 80s, they think of either the Jupiter 8, so the flagship, or the Juno series of just like classic sounds. And the JX3P kind of gets left out in the cold. It wasn't really dissimilar from a Juno. It had a little more grit to it, and great for funky sounds. So listen to this part on its own. It almost, what it reminds me of a little bit now listening back, even though I didn't have this in mind, is Jump by Van Halen. Let's see if I can play that. That kind of descending feeling. I'm not going to force myself to stumble all over Jump in front of you and humiliate myself at this point, but you get the idea. It's that brass sound. If the first place in my beloved 80s synthesizer sounds goes to the Yamaha DX electric piano, second place has to be anything that's analog brass. And there are two sounds, analog brass kind of sounds in this song. This is one of them. And let's layer that in with the piano so you can see how it plays, sort of syncopates with, and also adds some interesting extensions to the chords. I really liked that. This isn't the only song where I've added a sort of syncopated staccato brass thing over the chorus. The other one that I'm thinking of is Forget the Sunset, which is a song that's already released. So go check that out if you're interested. I use the same kind of motif, if you will. And I used the JX3P for another part in this song. What was it? Let's see. Oh yeah, this ARP that I already played you. It kicks the whole song off with this sort of like extended delay repeating throughout, and it appears again here in this break between the first chorus and the second verse. I think I take it up an octave over here. Yeah, so that's cool. So what I had in mind with that, like I said, was it's sort of another inspired by Lucky Star or Madonna songs of that period of time, but it also reminds me of a Commodore 64 or an NES kind of an ARP. It was very common in those days trying to get around the limitations of early game consoles. They couldn't really play chords because each of the channels, and there might have only been 3, 4 audio channels, was monophonic. And so sometimes to fake a chord, what they would do is quickly play the notes of the chord in succession in an arpeggio, but really fast, you know. So they weren't actually hitting simultaneously, because that was impossible for one voice, but they'd have that voice play, you know, really fast, like 64th notes. Functionally, it sounded like a chord, and they could sort of get around the limitations of only being able to play one note at the exact same time. But a lot of this sound is actually the delay that I have going on here. It's built in. If I turn that off, it's going to sound different. It's just kind of one repeat or two repeats. That extended nature of it comes from the delay, with a lot of feedback on it. So that's another JX3P sound for ear candy's sake. What else haven't I walked you through yet? Oh yeah, talking about brass sounds. This is UVI's Chroma, which is a recreation of the Rhodes Chroma synthesizer, which is really rare, pretty sought after. It was initially a synth developed by the ARP company, super important back in that era. But no matter how important they were, and no matter how iconic their synths were and are, they hit financial difficulties at some point, and I think they were bought out by Rhodes. Yes, the same Rhodes, to my knowledge, that makes the Rhodes suitcase electric pianos. But this synthesizer is just a super warm sounding. I'm so close to getting jump that it's frustrating me. But you know the sound. And so what I've done with this one is I wanted to give some added thickness to the main chords, but not until later in the song, right here in the second verse, and then later in the solo section and the choruses. So again, sort of delayed gratification, waiting to add something new till later in the song. So let me just play for you. Let me just solo up what I did with this Rhodes Chroma brass sound. So kind of a lower voicing and some tight voicings there to complement and sort of fill out what the piano, the electric grand, does. And that gives a really satisfying feel to the second half of that second verse that wasn't there in an earlier verse. and it continues on into the chorus there. And another thing that I did with this was to it almost is never advisable from a songwriting perspective and from the perspective of maintaining the interest of your audience to have an instrument play through the whole song. Drums are sometimes an exception because they can do so many different things, and maybe you have the kick in and the rest of the kit out or whatever, but you'll see that almost everything here has some gaps. Like the bass drops out in this break and it's not in the intro. All the ear candy stuff is just sporadic, maybe in the choruses but not the verses. But I had the CP80 in for most of the song because it's accompanying the vocal, and I wanted to drop it out at some point. So what I chose to do is drop it out here in the guitar solo, and that chroma brass poly sound takes over the chords. So let's listen to that in context. Underneath that guitar solo, it gives the guitar solo and the effects on it some more space to breathe and shine instead of being dominated by the piano. It also gives the listener a break from hearing the piano so that when it comes back in, you feel it. Yeah, you really feel that impact of the piano come back at that chorus. Also, the drums sort of are whittled down at that point too, which enhances the impact of the piano. And also I changed the chord voicings a little bit underneath the melody, the chord voicings the piano plays, that is. So yeah, just because this is now the third time that the audience has heard the chorus, let's change it up and keep it a little bit different, at least in this section, right? So that when we go back to the final chorus and it's more like it had been previously, it has some delayed gratification again. So yeah, let's just listen to that so you can kind of hear how chorus 3 is different from chorus 4, and it allows a sort of build to happen. And another technique I used here was to add a tag or a coda to the end, after what would have been 8 bars of the chorus. It falls, outside of it. And often when I do that, and in the case of this song, it's for this reason. It's because you allow the last lyric, which happens to be the title of the song and the lyrics of this song, to be repeated one more time. All right, so let's just see. If I walked us through all the instrumentation, I think almost everything. Again, all of this gear was manufactured and sold and was popular between about 1980 and 1984, which gives us a faithful recreation of the sound of that era. Even though I'm writing a new tune with it, I'm using the same ingredients that a Hall & Oates or a Madonna might have been using in the studio back then. So again, it's that Oberheim DMX drum machine from Addictive Drums 2 Real Machines. This bass is from the Square One plugin, like I said. This is going to be on my to-do list, is to replace this, because I never was super fond of the sound. It's a little farty to me, to be totally frank. Let's listen to that. In the track, it's pretty satisfying because it has a good amount of punch and some good low end, but I'm going to replace it for a couple of reasons. And it doesn't particularly emulate like a known piece of gear from the time. Not that that's super crucial, but it just a note. We have the Yamaha CP electric grand piano, also from Excellent Audio from Addictive Keys. Couple guitars. Oh, and on these guitars, I don't even own a guitar amplifier anymore in my studio. I mean, I actually have one in storage, but I don't use it because I use Native Instruments Guitar Rig to get all of my guitar tones. It's a wonderful library of amps and pedals and recreations of stuff from the age. And so for this funky guitar part, I can't remember if I used a preset here or if I actually, this is something I created myself. I can't actually remember. But let me solo that up really quickly. I used Roland Jazz Chorus emulation, you know, super, and some compression here. So obviously for funky 80s guitar sounds, lots of compression, plenty of chorus is usually the name of the game. A little bit of room reverb there. But so the tone is something I'm definitely probably going to keep from the guitar rig. I think I have some more EQ. Yeah, some more EQ from Slate VMR. But I'm going to retrack that part because, again, it was a scratch part and now it sounds super weird having been transposed. Same thing for the lead guitar tone, also guitar rig 5. This is a preset, I'm pretty sure, solo with some delay. And again, we've got the Yamaha DX1 for a couple of parts, the Rhodes Chroma for one part. This had been the instrument I originally used for the brass part, but it wasn't quite cutting it. The Roland JX3P for a couple parts, some of the funky parts, and Emulator II for a couple parts. So those are the ingredients, the highly 80s ingredients that I used to cook up this song. And I think that what I'm going to do just to wrap up this video is say a couple more things about songwriting. I've already peppered this video with some things about songwriting. And then I want to tell you sort of where do I go from here, where I plan to go from here to finish up the production on this session and finish the song. So this was a song where I started with the melody, and I think that it shows because, as I mentioned in another video, I'm a huge proponent of starting with the melody. It allows you to have a really solid, a memorable melody, a singable melody, and then build really interesting chord progressions around that. And so, one of the principles that I followed with this melody was to really sort of move upward from the verse to the chorus to make it sound more climactic. So you see that there's this climbing phrase that leads us up to a higher register from the verse into the chorus. And the melody, there's also a melody for the bridge, which goes even higher, although in sort of tinkering with the vocals and sort of ironing the kinks out for a vocalist, to sing this, I've kind of brought it down a bit because the range of this vocal was getting extensive. So then I went from there to the chords. One thing I'd like to talk about with these chords is that, let me make sure I'm playing the right instrument here. Back to the piano. So one thing that I did to add further variation and texture was the first time I play the chords, that it's very straight. These are just triads. Right, we got a G major. Well, it's because it's being transposed, it's no longer these chords, but I'm playing them in the key of D. They're being transposed into the key of B, but major, B minor, A major. But then when we repeat them later, I add extensions to them to make them sound thicker, and you know, really does give a kind of 80s vibe to it. What I'm doing there is this goes from being a G major to being a add 9 chord. That second there is a ninth. I love that chord voicing. What do I do here? Well, I drop this note, which is the root of the B minor, down one whole step. What is that? Well, that's the same as playing this is a 7th chord. Here's the 7th up top. But what if I, instead of making the 7th up top, which doesn't flow nicely, if I just drop this root, because I got the root in the left hand down, and there's the 7th. Another 9 chords. So we got add 9, 7, add 9. And those extensions just offer something new for the listener, and also sort of, you know, amp up the vibiness of it. Yeah, so I went from the melody to adding chords to adding in the drum machine rhythm. And the way I approach writing drum parts for the Go Small, because this is how it was done really in the 80s, if a drum machine was your drummer, is to do it in sets of 8-bar patterns. So I might write an 8-bar pattern for the verses, and then a separate 8-bar pattern for the choruses, and a separate 8-bar pattern for the bridge. And that's why you'll hear that there's quite a bit of repetition here. Let's just play that. I'm going to solo up the drums so you can hear one verse pattern, a chorus pattern, and the bridge pattern all back to back. So you get the idea. So if this had been an actual, 80s production with an actual DMX drum machine, I would have been using the input buttons to, beat out a pattern on the kick drum, and then maybe the snare drum on top of that, and just building as we went along, and then save that as one pattern, and then create a new one for the chorus. And then a different one for the bridge. And so some of the variations you heard are in the verse. There's the claps. They aren't present in the chorus, but the snare gets a little busier. In the bridge, we've got this hat pattern, which is very sort of disco inspired. And the clap comes back doing its thing. So that's my approach to writing drum rhythms for the Go Small's 80s inspired tracks, because that's how it was done in the day. Cut up some patterns, 8-bar patterns that are used in the song, just like you would have done on a DMX or a Lindrum machine. So yeah, okay, so talked a bit about starting with the melody, wrote some chords around it, built the rhythm in a very 80s way. The bass, to me, always needs to glue together the rhythm and the chords and the melody. And so it has a couple different roles here. Like in the verse, it's playing one thing. In the chorus, I think it goes into a lower register. And then in the bridge, it sort of, to complement the disco hi-hat pattern, it has a disco feel of these sort of eighth notes. Let's sample some of that. This is the verse. Because the chords in the piano are so sustained, it's nice for the bass to be a little more, if not syncopated, certainly, staccato. and then in the chorus it's a little different. The phrases start a little more legato. And then let's come to the bridge so you can hear how it has this very 80s eighth note pattern. That's a very Italo disco kind of bass line right there. And then we're back. So yeah, so I'm not going to make this video last much longer. My goal for this was really to give you a sense for how I approached writing this session, this early to mid 80s pop session, from the perspective of remaining authentic to the era, using the ingredients from the era to inspire me and to sort of correlate with the sound I had in my head, and then how the songwriting process of building out a song from one thing to the other, from the melody to the chords to the rhythm to the bass, and then adding all the spices, if you will, of these other parts. It's kind of interesting sometimes to solo up. I already soloed up for you the backbone of the song, the drums, bass, keys, and melody. Sometimes it's interesting to solo up everything but that and hear what you've got. The spices, so to speak. Whereas that ARP, take it down a bit, we've got the orc hits. Over here in the verse we got the bell-like ARP from the DX. And then things fill out a little more in the chorus. And in the break we bring in the guitar for the first time. I panned the guitar slightly left, or actually I think hard left, so the ARP could be hard right. And then later on in the song you get things, you know, kind of even thicken up more. And is that tasty? Yeah. Does it have flavor? Yeah. But is it essential to the song? No. It's just there to enhance the core parts of the arrangement. All right. So again, this is a tune called Say You Will. It's going to be on the Ghost Small's upcoming EP in Rewind, along with some other songs really inspired by this core period of like 1980 to 1985. I hope this glimpse behind the scene has been interesting. Where I'm going to take this next, and I don't know if I'm going to make this as a video, but just so you know the rest of the production for this, I've already gone through in other sessions and cleaned up the MIDI that was there. Obviously, if I was playing a part and really into it and I made a mistake, I can clean up the MIDI or re-record the part. I've already done that. So these are clean performances, with the exception of the guitars. So I'm going to replace the guitars now in this new key. I'm going to replace the bass sound probably, because it's just not satisfying to me, and I think what I'll probably do is look at something like Native Instruments Monarch, which is a Moog monophonic synthesizer. Emulation would be great for this song, also really appropriate for the time period. And then I've actually just got a couple lines of lyrics to finish up before hopefully getting a vocalist to cut this, and then it'll be on to mixing and mastering. So that's what remains for this song, for the process, and maybe the next time you hear it will be on another video like this, or maybe the next time you hear it, it'll be released. So keep an eye open for that EP in Rewind from the Ghost Small. And it's been really fun to meet up with you retro music lovers again. I hope this has been informative and or entertaining, and please stay tuned for more videos taking you back to the 80s. Let's just play. I'm going to play you out here with the last parts of this song. Take care, guys.